Welcome to Case Q&A, a deeper dive into the popular True Crime Arizona podcast. Our focus this episode, the murder of Gary Triano, the millionaire real estate businessman killed by a car bombing in Tucson in the parking lot of a luxury resort. I'm Kris Pickel, joining you for a discussion with the journalists behind the True Crime Arizona podcast, reporter Briana Whitney and producer Serjio Hernandez. And guys, this was huge news when this happened in 1996. So let's start by recapping the crime itself.
So Gary Triano was a very popular, well-known businessman in Tucson at the time. And Tucson has its kind of ritzy side. Gary was definitely involved in that. He was wining and dining everybody, taking lavish trips, making business deals left and right. But this time in his life, he was starting to financially crumble a bit. There was a market crash. Things weren't going as well. But he was still portraying that image of class, of wealth, of luxury. And he belonged to the La Paloma Golf Club and was out golfing on this Friday. And he actually was going to have a birthday party. He didn't know it. There was a surprise party at his house, and he would have come back from the golf club to go to his surprise birthday party. He never made it to the birthday because he comes outside, he walks to his car, he gets in the car, he notices there's some weird device package on the passenger seat. He looks over, and the bomb goes off. And we're talking a massive explosion. I mean, down the street, there were parts of this car, fragments of it found, and Gary immediately died from the bomb in his car.
And we should point out, La Paloma is this beautiful resort, views overlooking Tucson, very plush, as you said. You have this millionaire blown up at a luxury resort. This wasn't done in private. It almost seemed like this was a public message was being sent. And does it seem like that is where investigators went with this?
Yes. Right away, the thought and really the rumor mill was that, Gary had mafia relations. This was the mob. You know, they bomb people. They put bombs under cars, and that's something they do. And in Tucson, I mean, people weren't just getting bombed left and right. It was a very, very weird and unusual circumstance. So right away, I think investigators went down the mob alley of looking into, was he doing bad business deals or money dealings with the mob, and could he have pissed them off, and were they retaliating? I mean, I think that was a huge part of the initial investigation.
They ended up clearing that. I mean, they investigated that path and just nothing popped up. So what were some of the other theories?
Gambling. Gary made a lot of his money off of business deals, but he also was a pretty big player in terms of bringing Native American gambling to Tucson, specifically bingo. So he was real involved in those, but he had lost a lot of money in that too. And I think that was exactly where detectives went right away. Well, he made a lot of money. He was this kind of schmoozy guy and had lost a lot of money. So where could that have gone wrong? And not just investigators thought that. Even one of our interviews thought that. Ron Lehman, he was Gary's not only personal friend, but his attorney on big lawsuits, big business lawsuits, lots of money involved. And
so had Gary made a lot of people angry during business dealings?
It sounds like it from people that we interviewed. So it wasn't crazy that could have been the case. I mean, we know money drives people to do weird things. How many times do we see that in this business covering these crimes that we do? It almost always involves money. And Ron had a specific person in mind that he knew in the deposition of a lawsuit.
Dude, tell us more about this.
Yeah.
Who did he think did it? You don't have to name them, but
I don't know the name because Ron didn't want to divulge the name because obviously nothing came of it. But Ron had remembered in a deposition for a case that he worked on with Gary that this guy was mad about what had happened, about a lot of money lost at Gary's fault.
So, Gary was costing people money.
Yeah, and the way Ron described Gary as a very flamboyant type of guy, I mean, he laid out that he was involved in Native Americans gambling, getting that started, multi-million-dollar real estate loans and real estate development.
He would cut deals on the golf course, too.
Yeah.
Like, he'd take these guys golfing. He would frequently golf with Donald Trump. I mean, the big names in finance of the time, and even still today, he was out there golfing in Tucson.
He ran in that circle.
Absolutely. And he would cut deals while he would do it.
Yeah. So, I mean, you could tell by somebody that's running in those circles, something probably went wrong at times and people, got screwed.
Absolutely. And you've already touched on this a little bit, but I want to touch on it a little bit more because it kind of takes it forward. Just about every article says millionaire real estate developer. That's even how I introduced him. But it sounds like he was broke at the time.
Yeah. I mean, Ron Lehman described it as he had lost hundreds of thousands of dollars. And even Detective Gamber, too, the main detective on the case, who's now retired, says he was getting his dry cleaning through somebody else's name and living in another house. Like, he was trying to keep that image up, but really had lost hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Through the investigation, do you guys get the feeling that this is why his marriage fell apart?
Yes, to an extent. I think he's kind of a volatile guy. Yes, I think Pamela Phillips was his second wife, and he had multiple kids with her, and she too, like Gary, very much basked in this life of luxury. And so I think when that picture starts to crumble and your life that you've shown to the public is kind of a lie, I don't think that she liked that. And she actually was a pretty successful real estate agent herself too before she met Gary. So I think that the crumbling of the finances also led to the crumbling of their marriage.
And ultimately, she would be one of two people convicted of killing Gary Triano, her husband.
But my God, it took a long time to get there.
This is one of the crazy parts, is they really didn't, it seems like she wasn't investigated for a couple of years afterwards. And typically an ex or somebody you're married to, they will go right to it. But that seems to be, investigators will take a hard look at that person. But it seemed like they were so focused on, this was a public message. Let's go for, it has to be mob, it has to be gambling, it has to be something. And one thing that's interesting is they had the information. First, I'm going to let you tell me what was the motivation for the murder. They eventually figured it out. Explain the motivation.
So we should say, I think part of why they didn't look at Pam Phillips first is because she wasn't living in Tucson at the time. She had moved to Aspen, Colorado with their two kids while Gary stayed in Tucson after their divorce. She was ultimately found guilty, but the winding road to get to how it worked was long, but on the face value, it comes down to the life insurance policy. And I feel like that
comes down to money
every time. We hear that a lot. I wouldn't say that's uncommon. But for whatever reason, I think while they were investigating those other efforts, Pam wasn't looked at a whole lot. She also wasn't in Tucson. So she had an alibi to physically where she was when Gary was bombed. She was not here. However, where investigators started to realize that she may be involved was because Ron Young was a man that she was a neighbor with in Aspen. She had met him there. He was an older man, and he had defrauded a lot of people, including Pam. But weird, because Aspen police start questioning all these people that he had defrauded, and Pam was not willing to cause any issues, wouldn't admit to it, didn't want him to get in trouble for it, and
he stole a lot of money from me, but it's okay. I'm not going to go after him.
Yeah, right. And so, of course, that's a red flag to Aspen police. Like, why would she not want this man who stole this money to face the consequences for that? That's when Tucson police started getting involved as well, and that's when things get crazy.
A crazy amount of evidence was found. It's rare that you hear so much evidence. How did police find all the evidence linking Ron and Pamela to the murder?
Oh, where do I even start?
Well, I would say this actually goes back to Detective Gamber's, the way they investigated, how you said, why didn't they go straight to the wife? They started through the finances first. They started doing all the finances, finding out where Gary's money was and how he lived and survived. And that goes back to what you guys were saying in terms of, he didn't have any money. He was having his dry clean done under somebody else's name, just stealing from them. But then there's a very public murder that doesn't happen like that. Mm-hmm. He was executed, blown up. Mm-hmm. So, from a police standpoint, the way Gambers described it is, that's what we're going to go down. We're going to go down that road because that looks like somebody wanted you to see him killed because he did something wrong. And then there was all these talks about him being a mafioso, or being involved with the mafia, I should say. So they ran down every investigation that they could in terms of his finances. And then that's when they started getting to Pam's finances and finding out.
What's an interesting little nugget to throw in here, though, is our chief investigative reporter, Morgan Lowe, was a cub reporter at the time. He was the first person on the scene, covered the murder. Next day, he meets with a business associate of Gary Triano's. And this associate tells Morgan, it's the wife, it's the insurance policy. And Morgan does a story. So that story is out there. Police, what ultimately ends up being the motivation, they were aware of that. And it just took so long to go through all these other possibilities. So they had that information. But now let's skip to the evidence that they found. They went after Ron Young. This is years after the murder. This is years after the murder. At least, I think, maybe 3 years.
At least
or
3
something.
years. They go after Ron Young for the defrauding case. Ron Young has fled Aspen, Colorado. They find the car he was in Yorba Linda, California. And inside the car, they find, I can't even believe that all this is in the car. They find a map of Tucson, info of Gary's divorce and financial situation, names that are associated closely with Gary Triano now. They find a shotgun, and then they also find a note that says saw-off shotgun. What?
Yeah, right.
Like, it's just like a gift to authorities. Like, here you go. Here is everything. But the authorities actually had problems getting the county attorney's office to go after them.
Yeah, for whatever reason, the county attorney's office wanted every I to be dotted, every T to be crossed, and every specific thing to be shown to them, and made sure they had no doubts. So the first time that Detective Gambers presented everything, mostly based on the finances and everything else, they said, no, it's not good enough. Well,
and we should note, too, there was even more found because they didn't find Ron with the car. They found a car. They didn't find Ron. They ended up locating Ron. Actually, this is so crazy. America's Most Wanted does a show, an episode about Ron Young, and his chiropractor in Florida, where he had ended up, says, calls in. This guy has an appointment on Monday. So what do police do? They show up. It's Ron Young. They arrest him, and inside the car, I don't know why he leaves things. He leaves tapes, cassette tapes. They put it in. They start listening. Oh, it's Pam and Ron talking about the murder. And they can show that there's been money being sent back and forth through FedEx from Pam in Aspen to Ron in Florida. And on these tapes, they start talking about things. I think Gamber says that Ron says, you got your 2, I want my 4, which they ended up finding out that the life insurance policy was worth $2 million. So Pam got the $2 million because it was under their kid's name, but the kids were minors. And she was paying Ron somewhere around $400,000 for the murder.
So they get Ron.
Yeah.
But she takes off.
Yeah, well, they were keeping eyes on her in Aspen, and just before they go to arrest her, she's gone. She not only gone, she flees the country. So now, where's Pam? And they have to basically start from scratch to find her. They first get led to Switzerland, and they have her. They know where she is. And then the county attorney's office decides to put out a public statement that says, we're taking death penalty off the table because we can't get her back here extradited to the United States if death penalty is on the table.
And let's be clear, she hasn't been arrested at this point.
No. So they put that out there. Well, now that's out there, right? So
So she knows that they know where she is.
So she flees again. So they get there. They're working with the Swiss police, and there's no Pam because she knows they're coming for her. So eventually, they still work with the police over there and track her to Vienna, Austria. And they had her passport and everything, and they bust in the hotel room. She's with another guy in bed. Nice. And then she's like, I'm not Pam Phillips. And they're like, we have your passport. Like, you're Pam Phillips. And she's like, okay, you're right. I'm Pam Phillips.
And then they get her in custody.
Finally.
But this is in another country.
In another country. So Gamber says he's expecting it to take 3 years to extradite her back here. But Austria's like, we don't want her. So they send her back here within 6 months, it's crazy fast when it comes to an extradition process. And Gamber is waiting there at the Tucson airport, waiting to finally, take her and put her in handcuffs like he wanted to for years.
I also thought it was a little funny that she left that much money too. Like Austria's like, she left, what did she leave in the bank account there?
I don't think I know about this part.
You're right. She did leave money in the bank account.
I think it was somewhere around $1.5 million, something like that. She left it in a bank account there, and Austria's like, yeah, you can have her. Really quick extradition. And then Austria's like, we're going to keep the money.
Oh, they kept the money?
Yeah.
You would think that would have been evidence, but
who knows?
Interesting.
When you get to different countries, stuff changes apparently.
One of the things I thought that was really interesting in the podcast was she wasn't going to get off the plane. Like, she had a choice?
Yeah. So I feel like in this entire investigation, when we hear more from Pam, which we will, in this, we'll talk about it here, but she's very entitled, almost as if the rules don't apply to her, and that she's still this, rich, not famous, but well-known, well-revered woman of Tucson, when in reality, she is a alleged criminal who possibly, at this point, because she wasn't convicted yet, was the mastermind behind her ex-husband's bombing assassination.
So it took, 18 years, but she's finally convicted in the murder.
Finally, but she originally was supposed to be on trial earlier, and she was deemed mentally incompetent. So the trial got pushed back even later. So finally, she was convicted of first-degree murder, life in prison.
And Ron had already been convicted.
Right. Same thing, life in prison. But Pam wasn't convicted until 2014. Oh my gosh, this happened in 1996. You can imagine that is a long time to wait for justice. And then Pam actually sat down with CBS's 48 Hours in her jail cell, and in the jail, or in the prison, I should say, to do an interview.
In the TV version that you guys did of this, there is a progression of the pictures of Pamela from when she was married to booking photos to then the video of her interviews. Can you see a difference in her from the change in time? It almost seems like you see her going mentally downhill.
Yes.
She does have it
doesn't even look like the same person.
It doesn't. It looks like a transformation.
Yeah. It's something about her eyes. I don't know what it is. You see her in the interview. She doesn't. And then you hear some of her sound bites in 48 Hours, and you don't think she's basing stuff in reality.
She's very almost whimsical, I would say. Very not in tune with what's actually happening.
And you guys went through a lot of the video from the 48 Hours and interviews and everything. What are some of the claims she was making in those interviews?
She was making claims that I hadn't heard. I mean, she did say, we all had death threats. She had death threats. The kids had death threats. Gary had death threats. Everyone was being threatened. She talks about a lot of physical abuse from Gary.
She's very emphatic that he was physically abusive to her.
Yeah, and that's not something that anybody else has really talked about.
No.
And so I don't even know really what's true and what's not. She also claims that, she's best friends with Donald Trump and Marla Maples, and I love them.
And talks like she had just seen them recently. It's like, we're buddies. When in actuality, she's been gone for a while.
Yeah, there's definitely something off. She talks as if she wasn't convicted of this crime, but that all of what's happened for over a decade hasn't happened. It's very disconnected.
And that she was framed. She's adamant that she was framed, that she didn't do anything. Somebody
Innocent.
framed her.
So that's where she is still sticking to that story to today.
Correct.
In going back with this case, there are so many elements of it. What is the biggest thing that stands out to you about this case that you didn't expect to find or know or learn when you started going through it?
It sounds kind of morbid, but the way they found his body, I expected, you hear a car explosion, a bomb sitting next to you in a passenger seat. You think the goriest details. This guy was blown up, arms, legs, limbs everywhere, blood. That wasn't the case. The doctor we spoke to, Sam Buttman, he was saying, and he says it in the podcast, that he was surprised by how pale he was, how white he was.
We should say a doctor. He just happens to be a doctor. He was the witness there, just signing up for golf time. So it just so happened that he had medical knowledge.
Yeah, so he was surprised at the body. He was like, there wasn't a lot of lacerations to the body. It was more, it was just a pale white body. And I assume that's just a concussion from the explosion.
And you were talking about how strong the explosion was, that parts of the car, the roof of the car was tossed. Was it a couple 100 yards or something?
Yeah, there were fragments all over the street. And I think they found some stuff in the swimming pool. It really went everywhere. I think for me, well, besides the actual bomb, right? I mean, that we don't see those happen. And just to a well-known guy in a nice place. I mean, that's shocking in and of itself. But I think for me, the fact that this went on for so long, that it took this long and they kept losing Pam, I mean, there were definitely some issues there. And, I mean, Gamber definitely is pretty critical of the county attorney's office at the time, the Pima County. Had things gone differently there, I think that Pam would have been in custody a whole lot sooner. And they could have avoided going overseas to have to find her. To me, it was just incredibly ridiculous that it took that long and that many twists and turns.
And there would have been answers and some justice so much earlier for Gary Triano's family, who, as we just briefly touched on, there were people waiting at his house for a surprise birthday party for him. They didn't know what had happened. They were waiting, and they were waiting.
Yep.
And they didn't find out until they turned the TV on.
Not even the TV. This is what's awful. Detective Gamber says all of the party goers that were waiting, they found out because Detective Gamber and the Tucson Police Department bust into the house looking for another bomb, thinking was something else planted? Was he involved himself? I mean, they break in, searching, and all these people are ready to celebrate. Horrible. I mean, what an awful way to find out. But just the circumstances.
Strange. What I pictured in my head was a family waiting for the surprise, for the big,
Surprise.
happy birthday, surprise. And instead they're getting ready for that.
So
and
bad.
the person that comes through the door, or as they answer the door, are police. And they're probably shuffling them all out, if I remember them right. Detective Gamber's telling me this. They're shuffling them all. Get out of the house, because they didn't know what was in there.
And it took 18 years for his wife to be convicted. So what was thought to be a high-profile mob hit at first just came down to an ex-wife who wanted money. On behalf of Briana, Sergio, and myself, thank you for joining us for this episode of Case Q&A, a discussion of True Crime Arizona.
At Grainger, we're for the ones who specialize in saving the day, and for the ones who've mastered the art of keeping business moving. We offer industrial-grade supplies for every industry, with same-day pickup and next-day delivery on most orders, all backed by real people ready to help. So you can get the right answers and products right when you need them. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.